guys can start. Thank
Okay,
you.
we'll go ahead and get started. Just a note for anyone who is watching live, this session is being recorded. This webinar will be about 1.5 hours, and if you have questions, as our host was saying, for our panelists during that time, you can put them in the chat. And we encourage your questions and discussions, and I am keeping an eye on those. We'll try and get to as many of those as possible during the session today. So we're all joining the session from our homes, so please welcome any pets or family members who inadvertently joined the discussion today. We welcome them all. That's just how things are. So we're in our best sweatpants tonight, and we thank DataCon for hosting this session today. It's diversity in data organizations, building a representative workforce and why it matters. I'm Rebecca Friedman, the founder and president of Corus Strategies, a public sector business development firm. I'm a gov geek, have worked in government in the past, and have a passion for data and technology and translating that to a way that it's understood by all. So welcome everyone to DataCon, and thank you for hosting, and to our event sponsors for making this event possible. So our panel discussion today is going to bring together experts in the field of diversity and data and discuss practical solutions, we hope, that can help every organization close the gap. So fairness in itself should be reason enough to embed diversity in our data science teams and in our processes. But there are significant practical considerations as well. This isn't just a matter of fairness. Study after study has shown the positive impact of workplace diversity on everything from employee satisfaction and engagement to productivity and profitability. So with a diverse workforce, organizations can embody their ethics and values in their processes and services and develop solutions that reflect a nuanced understanding of the full range of human experience. While it matters for every kind of company, diversity is especially important for the public sector or education as the stewards of public data and data science powered business. A model is only as good as its training, and it's all too easy to build blind spots and bias into systems. So today, this panel that we have spans private and public sector, education and nonprofit and entrepreneurs who are bringing the value and importance of diversity in data and diversity, equity, and inclusion in data organizations. So I'll start by introducing our panel. We have one who hopefully will be joining us shortly, and that's Nicholas Hastings. I'll introduce him when he arrives. We also have Samta Kapoor, who is a senior manager with Accenture. She's in my upper left-hand corner of Hollywood Squares, but she may be in a different section of your screen. There, she leads organizational transformation, helping clients drive innovation and optimizing business processes. She's part of the AAI team at Accenture, where she works extensively with 3 A's. She says analytics, automation, and AI to enable insights. She describes her job as being a data storyteller and AI strategist, which I love. She earned her MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, has a master's degree in engineering management from Duke University, and is an electronics and telecommunications engineer. That background enables her to bring the best of technology and business aspects to bear while solving client challenges. So in addition to that, she fits in practicing salsa dancing, an interest which she dove into working in Chile and Argentina. And she also gets an additional exercise chasing after her toddler. So I'd like to do a quick icebreaker with all of our speakers as we go through their intros. So I'd like to ask Samta what her first job was.
Oh, my first job, Rebecca, was actually being a watchwoman in a museum where I literally had to make sure that no one's touching any of the art pieces that are at display. And it was a fun job, but I will never forget that because that was my...
Yeah. Requires some patience and some customer service skills.
Absolutely.
Crowd management.
Yeah, keeping a watch on all the data, right? Basically watching people coming in and going out. So
did you have one of those clickers? Those clickers for
yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Right.
Done all of that. But,
okay.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Rebecca. Thank you, DataCon. Super excited.
Our next speaker is Dr. Lindsay Poirier. I think everyone has trouble pronouncing those French last names, so we apologize. She is a cultural anthropologist and recent PhD, congratulations, in science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Her research examines digital expertise, data cultures, and the theorization of digital infrastructure. More specifically, She studies the design of semiotic infrastructures. Is that right? Did I get it? All right. Okay. Or digital infrastructures that encode data syntax, semantics, and relationships to other data. Many of you may be familiar with that. She examines how the designers of that infrastructure learn to bring diverse language ideologies to their work, and how such language ideologies work with knowledge and get order in information systems. She's conducted historical research on approaches to digital knowledge representation in the artificial intelligence community, and field work with both the semantic web community and the community of practitioners building data standards for the human services. Her most recent publications include Devious Design, Digital Infrastructure Challenges in Experimental Ethnography. So Lindsay, why don't you share with us what your first job was?
Yeah, so I'm from a very small town, small rural town in Massachusetts, and my first job was bagging groceries at our local grocery store.
And now I have to follow that up with, what small town are you from? Because I'm also from a small town in Massachusetts.
I'm from Blackstone, Massachusetts.
Oh, I think you're on the other side of the state where they have a more fun accent. I'm from Western Massachusetts. So the next speaker, Vince Vu. Throughout his career, Vince has been most passionate and creative in roles where he leads efforts to operationalize visionary thinking. His strengths are in taking big ideas and building roadmaps to get us there, especially by evangelizing, simplifying, and democratizing data. With an extensive background in data analytics, he's worked proudly to lift the fog of war, as he says, over statistics and demystifying number crunching. As a recovering analyst, which I also love that phrase, he is unapologetic in his belief that the most successful organizations lead from the heart rather than the head. He currently helps public sector clients design, build, and strategize expertise management programs at Qualtrics. His team helps government and education harness the most relevant data to improve outcomes for their constituents. Before joining Qualtrics, he led a feedback and analytics group at King County, Washington, which is where Seattle, most people will know of Seattle being based there. In that team, he managed employee, customer, and resident insight. So Vince has a master's degree in public policy and concentrations in public and nonprofit leadership and management and urban regional affairs. That's basically everything. From the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. So Vince, why don't you share with us what your first job was?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca. My first job was basically a music teacher's assistant. And so I got to teach little kids how to play music, which, if we're being honest, was basically daycare. So
daycare / school of rock.
That's right.
A little bit, yeah. We did see when we did a prep call that Vince has a cello in his background, and it's not just a prop, he does play the cello. And then we saw that Nicholas joined us, so I'll go ahead and give an intro to him, and maybe he'll join us on video, and I'll ask him what his first job is as well. So Nicholas Hastings is a self-proclaimed tinkerer, maker, and all-around gearhead. He's a Sacramento native and proud CSUS alumni with a BS in mechanical engineering. He's the co-founder and executive director of Square Root Academy, an organization that provides STEM-based education and experience to underrepresented groups, all at no cost to the participants. The program works with several local school districts in Sacramento to provide after-school programming for 5th through 12th graders, while also sponsoring STEM-focused community events. And I've been following the Square Root Academy for some time, and they've had an excellent pivot during COVID and managed to transform a number of their programs rapidly to be able to continue to engage the community. The Sacramento Business Journal named Hastings to its 2019 40 Under 40 list, which recognizes young professionals in the Sacramento region who excel in their workplace and community. Nicholas, we're doing a quick icebreaker by asking everyone what their first job was. Can you share with us what your first job was? Oh, we can't hear you yet. Still having audio. In the meantime, I'll share with you what my first job was. This will be a place that Lindsay is familiar with, being from the Bay State. I was a CIO, or it was really a chief ice cream officer at Friendly's restaurant, where I was a fountain girl. So if everyone's been to the East Coast, they're familiar with Friendly's restaurant. So we have a lot of echo coming from Nicholas. We'll let him sort that out with the host, and we'll get back to him in a bit. So we'll go ahead and get started by jumping into things. We'll talk about sort of the foundation of this conversation, which to me is why it matters. There's kind of two pillars that we're going to be talking about today, and that's one, why diversity in actual data collection matters, as well as the diversity and representation in organizations and how that plays into the diversity in data. So I think it's important to set that stage by providing some examples of how data, particularly public data, has been misused, misunderstood, or misrepresented in the past with adverse results. So it's also important to note how bad data, as we say, has been recovered or repurposed for good. So we're hoping to hear a few examples from our panelists, if they could share some of the work they've done and the context to the conversation that we'll have. So I'll start with Lindsay, who has done some work in New York City with data collection. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to apologize. I can't get the Zoom background. I did an update right before, and now all of a sudden it won't let me change my background.
You're still one of the team.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. So before I started at Davis, I worked at Beta NYC, which was a New York City-based civic technology organization. And my job there as an anthropologist was to study how communities were using the city's open data sets and how they were kind of building their values around those data sets, and also to understand what were some of the consequences of having that data publicly available. So one data set that I studied quite a bit at the time and that I now teach with at Davis is New York City's Stop, Question, and Frisk data set. And so the Stop, Question, and Frisk data set is basically a spreadsheet that details every single time an officer stops an individual in New York City in a given year. And it includes information about the stop, so such as was the officer uniformed? Did the officer follow particular protocol for what to do during the stop? What were the demographics of the individual stopped? What were they suspected of? Whether or not it resulted in an arrest, and was there any kind of force used, right? So all of this information gets recorded by the officer themselves when they're actually immediately following the stop, right? And this data is public, and it actually has been incredibly important in activism, right? So in 2013, when the Supreme Court case around stop and frisk in New York City was being held, at that time, this particular data set was referenced constantly as a way to justify two things. First of all, that there was racial profiling involved in stop and frisk as it was being practiced in New York City. And second, that most of the time stops were not actually resulting in an arrest. In fact, only 2% of the time across all races were stops resulting in an arrest, and even fewer amongst the communities that were being disproportionately policed. And so it was also used to prove that stops were being conducted without reasonable suspicion, right? And even though it was incredibly important for showing that the practice was being run in an unconstitutional way, at the same time, even the judges that were responding to this particular case had noted in the court cases that this database is incredibly flawed, right? And so some of the problems with the data set are, one, it's one-sided, right? We're only hearing one side of the story because only officers themselves are actually producing the data. And two, it's probably incomplete because there's no kind of oversight as to whether or not a form is always being filled out following a stop, right? And so judges at the time noted that even though the data was showing the way that this practice was being carried out unconstitutionally, it was still very likely undercounting the number of stops, and the number of stops in particularly that were unconstitutional, just because of these flaws in the data set, right? And none of this even accounts for the fact that throughout the 1990s, policing had kind of developed this statistical form in New York City in which officers were actually institutionally incentivized to over-police certain communities in order to produce metrics that would show that they were actually responding to crime in their precincts, right? This is often referred to as juking the stats, if you've heard that term before. So for me, what the problem with this is that this data is completely solely produced by the same people that it's meant to hold accountable, right? And we see a lot of data sets like this throughout the country. Actually, data sets about toxics are oftentimes produced by the same facilities that are producing the toxic emissions, et cetera, right? And I think this really calls attention to the need for more diverse perspectives in data production, and the incredible challenges of actually building that into the systems that we're going to be perpetrating going forward.
Thank you so much for that. And so that sort of sets the foundation of why it matters to have that diverse perspective and that input and understanding in data. I love that you also brought up that very often people seem to know when there are issues with the data. I think, you know, when you talk to people, they recognize that their organizations may have challenges or may not at all be sort of willing, and this is sort of the broader organization, to share data so they have a best outcome, whether it's rules or bureaucracy that sets that up. Very often people recognize those challenges. So we'll try and get back to that later in the conversation. But it's an interesting point because I think people are sort of interested in improving, but there's all these challenges with sort of how do you get there. The other side of the conversation that we're wanting to talk about today is the workforce. So that question is, how does one define a representative workforce, and what value does that representative workforce bring? So how do you actually do that? What does that mean to be a representative workforce? And particularly in a data organization, what does that mean? So let me see if Nicholas's mic is working, and if we can do an audio check on him, because I'd love to hear his input on that. How's that
Sure,
going?
can you hear me?
Hear you great. Yeah. So I'd love to hear from you and Samta on this. So if you want to start to share with us, you know, what does that mean to have a diverse workforce within data and within maybe even broader technology organizations?
Sure. Well, to have a diverse workforce, you know, we have to think about what it really means to be diverse. And it's not just, you know, ethnic or racial background or socioeconomic status. It's so many different things that can actually culminate into adding diversity. And that could be whether it's, once again, those other attributes that I previously mentioned, but additionally, diversity in skill set, diversity in knowledge, because people's different backgrounds is going to contribute directly to what they actually know, their lived through experiences. So I believe that, you know, creativity, I think you already kind of hit the nail on the head with a little bit of my background. I'm very heavily interested in creativity, imagining new things and innovation and things of that nature. But in order for truly innovative things to come about, diversity is needed. Diversity and innovation really is a multitude of different schools of thoughts playing very well together and then producing a well thought out, efficient product. So that doesn't come from, you know, just having the same kinds of people in the room. You know, if you have everybody, they all have similar backgrounds, they're going to all think pretty linearly, which isn't going to leave much room for outside thinking outside of the box, where all innovation and creative things are really birthed. So what it means to have a creative, you know, a really diverse and inclusive workforce is to make sure that it's inclusive of all populations, and not just a singular type of person, a singular archetype of person.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Samta, I'd love to hear from you on this as well. We spoke at one point, and you were telling me a little bit about what your own organization is doing. You've also had the opportunity to work internationally. So sometimes that means diversity means a different thing in different places and different perspectives, and cultures will be necessary to be part of any conversation. So why don't you share some about that?
Absolutely. And I completely agree with what Nicholas was saying, right? Like, I think it is a very big piece of diversity to define diversity, right? Because it means different things to different people. For me personally, what it stands for is to have an inclusive workforce across genders, ethnicity, geographies, people with disabilities, LGBTQ, right? It means bringing everyone together. Right. And I think the big piece, tying it back to the data organization and to what Lindsay was saying about bias in data, right? If you have the same kind of people in a room, it is very hard to even identify that bias or have fairness in the data, right? You need a representative workforce to be able to work with that. And like today, we're living in a day and age where AI, ML, big data explosion has already happened, right? So it's not that there are just like small things that can, be under covers and no one would care about it. It's a big topic, and it is a very sensitive topic as well, because today AI ML is used even for like things like evaluating credit for loan applications, right? Where you can have the most biased data if you don't have a representative workforce. And with that in mind, I feel like, now, Rebecca, for the other part of your question was, what is your company doing, right? I feel really, really fortunate to work for a company like Accenture. We have done so much in this area, and we've made it so transparent that our numbers are actually out to the street and to our people, like our employees. We are all held accountable for this, right? We have 506,000 employees across the globe. The latest number that I remember, right? 215,000 of those are women. We also have employee-run groups where we have Asian American groups, women who come together to make sure that we have representation across the board, and also to make sure that that's how we build our teams to create client impact, right? So these are things that we do for us, but we also partner very closely with our clients. And there's this retail client that we're working with now to help them build a diverse workforce by having really good algorithms that can help them do a lot of things. We know companies have been in the news for having algorithms that don't really like women, right? So we're making sure that, things like that don't happen again. Like, we work closely with our clients and incorporate everything that we're telling them to our own self to make sure that everyone feels inclusive and represented.
And I do want to touch on later, getting into about building models and making sure those models don't have bias built into those. Vince, I also know that your company is doing a lot proactively to build this representative workforce and help others do that as well. And I think Samta touched on what I think is a key piece of that puzzle, which is being transparent about that. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that. I know that you've worked to help other organizations gather that information so they have the ability to be transparent. Many don't have the full picture to start.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think transparency is so key, and it starts from us, right? Like, we can't go tell our customers to be transparent if we're not transparent. And so one of the things that we did immediately was we took a stance, right? We at Qualtrics said, it's not enough to be just, we are anti-racist is the stance we took. And so we started off our kind of internal efforts by, first we hosted Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, wrote the book on how to be anti-racist, and he helped us really set the stage around what that means. And we immediately sort of launched work groups to look at our recruitment policies, our promotion policies, and some of our other internal work. And I think one of the great things that I saw out of this work is that it didn't place the onus of expecting kind of pretty massive change on Black, Indigenous people of color, right? Like, it wasn't that we suddenly had to lead these work groups that were being created. Qualtrics really wanted to sort of buck the trend of expecting their employees of color to shoulder the additional burden of changing the systems that oppress us. And so many of these projects were, very huge, transformational. We're working alongside now. I mean, it takes these are big systemic issues. But what I really like about it is the transparency of that we get these updates on how we're doing. At any point, we can look at any of these work groups and kind of see what the status of these projects are. And that this transformational work is being done in a way that honors the power within communities of color without expecting communities of color to, again, do extra work, do extra labor. And so we really take that to heart. And that's the same advice we give to our customers when we're advising them on how to build data strategies that really advance diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's a really great point, because it's not that everyone is sort of welcome to be a spokesperson for something if it's a cause that's important to them, but they shouldn't be expected to have to constantly speak up and speak out if that's not the path that they want to take within their organization. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Nicholas, we didn't get a chance to hear too much about Square Root Academy and what you're doing there to actively build a representative workforce, particularly within the Sacramento region, but I have a strong feeling it's going to sort of explode to be a national effort. And I know you partnered with others as well. So could you talk a little bit just practically about what you're doing to build that workforce? We understand that, you know, there needs to be multiple pipelines into workforce development, but you're certainly doing a lot to start that in the region.
Yeah, thank you. So a little bit more, and my apologies for the delay. I was trying to figure out Hoover and the background thing, but you know, we're here now. So apologies if I'm repeating what
Technology
Rebecca's
overload.
right? So what we do at Square Academy, we really focus on making sure that underrepresented youth have access to the fundamentals of STEM at no cost, to ensure true accessibility. So, you know, your coding, your 3D modeling, your data collection, things like that is what we have a heavy emphasis on. But in order to really make sure that we are building a representative workforce, we have to figure out where the disconnect started to begin with. And we often find that the disconnect, there's a lack of minorities within the professional realm of STEM, not necessarily because there is a lack of the aptitude to succeed in this realm, but more so a shortage of opportunity in the communities in which they're birthed. So we want to make sure that we're starting off young and then making sure that they know that, hey, this is something for you. So we in our program, we're about 42% little girls, which I'm super proud of. I want to say we're about 97% minorities in the scholars that we serve, and we serve over 3,000 scholars a year. So the hook and the really main point is to make sure that they are empowered to know that they can actually succeed in this industry. And one of the ways that we do that, outside of giving them the tools to empower them, we make sure that the people that are put in front of them, all of our educators, are actually people of color and are culturally representative of the populations that we're currently serving. That makes a huge difference. You know, it's kind of hard to imagine yourself in a position when you've never seen someone that actually looks like you in that position before. You know, furthermore, we make sure that we empower them academically. We expose them to college level rigor, with some of them actually being able to amass college level credit for participating in our programming. So we are making sure that they have all of the opportunities afforded to them that their more affluent counterparts may have. And I would say that it's hitting 3,000 kids a year. We're doing pretty good there. Making sure that they know the coding.
You've been doing this for just a few years now, right? It's really kind of had an explosion in the region, but it's just
yeah, yeah, we're a few years in. You know, I think this may have been mentioned prior to this. I was in the environmental engineering realm for a bit before I put that down in 2017, but started Square Root Academy with my co-founders, Didier and Ponte and Christina, back in 2016. And we've just been rolling ever since. You know, we started off teaching 52 kids, then a few hundred more, and now we're up to a few thousand. So really, you know, when people think that our main product here is STEM, I would say that our main product that we're really distributing is opportunity and exposure.
Yeah. I think it's that idea that you can't be what you can't see, right?
Exactly.
You can't sort of aspire to something that you haven't seen anyone do before. Someone
Exactly.
can be the first, but it's much easier if you don't have to be the first at everything. So I think that's excellent. So I want to shift a little bit into the data, what actually is good data, and then we'll lead back into the conversation around organizational building. But I think it's important that we talk a little bit about some examples of how data has been misused and misrepresented. Lindsay talked a little bit about that. And as a data community, I think we kind of understand the importance of good data storytelling. Samta even refers to herself as a data storyteller. And we know we should be answering questions. We always say, you know, let the data lead you to the right questions rather than starting with the question that you want answered. We hear that a lot in both data and kind of technology organizations. But I think it's hard for some people to kind of get over that and see how to let data guide those questions with, you know, if we haven't sort of successfully seen that before. So how do we do that and make that data truly representative? Like Lindsay was saying also, you know, there are plenty of examples, including the one that she shared, where judges understood that the data was bad or sort of faulty in some way. So we sometimes know what the problem is, but we don't know how to kind of take a step back and get to the right question. So what are some first steps or questions that someone should ask before collecting or interpreting data? That kind of falls into responsible AI and training models as well. But I'll start with Vince. If you can share either some examples you have or just sort of a first step that you have in guiding people to even understand what that concept of letting the data guide your questions means.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal question. One of the first things that I think about when I think of good data is that no data is agnostic, right? No data is apolitical, right? There are always humans behind the data that are designing the way the data are collected, the way the data are interpreted. There's no such thing as just pure data, right? There are people behind that muddle up the picture with their own unconscious biases, our own discriminations, and our own racism, really.
And it's the same way when people describe technology as magic, it's not magic.
Right.
Or,
it's not magic.
There's
not magic.
Someone's created all of the things that these things are doing.
And then a lot of times, like deliberately, they've created it to function in a way that's very deliberate. So a good component or a big component of good data for me is acknowledging that it is biased, right? And it is based on the researcher and the institutions that researcher comes from. And the other thing that I'll mention quickly too is when I think about good data, I think about data processes that need to involve the communities that the data are about, right? Like I think underrepresented communities we're over collected, right? Like there's so many questions that folks ask Black, Indigenous communities of color, and it feels very kind of transactional, feels very one way. And so when I think about good data and data processes, I also think about projects that involve the communities that don't really profit off of just the experiences and then leave and publish. I think it involves using the community in not just the data collection element as subjects, but this might be kind of scary, but also involved in sort of the analysis, the reporting, and the action based on the data. And so some of those thoughts, around the idea of good data, I think about this stuff a lot.
Good. I think we have to keep evolving that conversation, right? We have to, we can't really stop thinking about it. So I think that's what is going to lead us to. And even on a data related project, we see the evolution of those questions constantly happening. Right? It's very unlikely that you kind of sit in a meeting, especially these days, you would sit in a meeting, but you sit in a meeting, come to the conclusion of what you wanted to answer, and that would be the outcome of the sort of one question that you're trying to answer with some data. It's really more kind of all of the other pieces that kind of rise to the top that tell stories. So as a data storyteller, I'd love to hear your take on this as well, and maybe even some projects that you've worked on where you've started with one understanding of or maybe our clients have started with one understanding of what the data might lead you to, and it ended up being something very different.
Oh yeah, Rebecca, I've been in those situations where it's turned out to be something different, and then it's a battle to explain your data, right? But thank God, thank God for data. You don't have too many like gray areas.
That's right. Yes, you can always lean on the data to tell the tough story.
So it keeps me out of the equation. No, I'm kidding. It doesn't, but it's kind of fun because I feel like there are sometimes historic biases in the data that we just forget up front. Right? Like we just assume that, this data that we're working with is really good data, right? Like I don't think there's like a definition of good data, but I think just having the awareness of what your data is bringing to you, what are you trying to tell through that data, right? Like what are you really truly solving for? And are you really solving for without your bias in the data or no, right? Like for instance, when you use proxy variables, right? Are you using proxy variables that can bias the whole algorithm to give an output? Like how are you making all of that happen? Are you really labeling your data correctly, right? I feel like keeping all of these things in mind when you're building those algorithms and again, right, like there's no silver bullet. So it's not that if you do all of this, you are going to get the right answer, but at least these are some things that you can keep in mind as you're thinking about building these algorithms that you truly want to give insights that are actionable, but they're not biased. They are fair insights that people can use to make decisions. So those are things that I've seen with my clients come up a lot.
I think this one is really important. So I'm going to ask this one to Lindsay as well, with your work around creating some of those stories, particularly with government organizations and nonprofits?
Yeah, actually, so in my classrooms, anytime I teach classes about the politics of data, right? And specifically how communities can become inequitably represented through data. And one of the things that I tell my students on the first day is that anytime they use the word bias in their write-ups or whatnot, I want them to highlight the word, and then I want them to leave a comment in the assignment that indicates what kind of bias they're referring to, whose bias it is, and what are the consequences of those biases for what people, right? And the reason for that is because I feel as though sometimes when we talk about, especially when students that are coming to data for the first time talk about bias, they assume that it's a problem in data in and of itself, right? And in the process, they're assuming that numbers at some point can achieve this kind of quantitative objectivity. And in the process, they lose the historical decisions that went into people deciding what's going to count and what's not going to count, right? And so as I'm kind of encouraging students to think about this, I really want them to think about what kind of biases do we want at the table when we're figuring out what kind of data we want produced in the world. Is that bias towards equity? Is that bias towards inclusiveness? Or is that bias going to decrease those things? Right. And so for me, that's, I think, echoing both what Samta and Vince was talking about and bringing inclusive people at the table. If you only have one set of social groups deciding what is going to count and what biases are important to be in your data set, then it's not going to be representative and it's not going to be equitable.
Excuse me. Some tea went down the wrong way. Excuse me.
Oh no.
Happens to the best of us. No worries.
Yeah.
So hopefully you can, my voice will clear up as we go on. Lindsay, I'm hoping that means that your students don't just avoid using the word bias in their papers. You're still having those conversations.
Yeah, so we
Okay.
look to turn the conversation around questions of equity and representation within the data.
Okay.
And how do we ensure that we're having those kind of deep conversations about what counts as equitable representation within data and what doesn't count as equitable representation, and to just take it one step further than just referring to bias. Yeah.
So we did have a question come in, and this is sort of a practical question about, I think it relates to this good data conversation. And that was, what happens when analytics fail? So it's especially true, excuse me, among smaller teams, for example, when investigating equity and fairness. So I'd love to, Vince, do you want to take that and give a shot when analytics fail?
Fail. That's really interesting. I think one of the concepts or one of the phenomenons that I think this question is asking about is when you're looking at data through an equity lens and you need to disaggregate, you need to zoom in. Sometimes with smaller teams, you can't, in order to protect anonymity and not call anyone out, you have to kind of mask the data. And that's something that happens a lot with our customers that are, looking at increasing slices of experience, right? Like, what are women's experiences, women's of color experiences, women of color with a specific tenure. As they keep slicing deeper and deeper, the groups get smaller and it gets harder to analyze. One of the things that we found out is, one, kind of elevating your analysis or elevating your actions to maybe the level higher than the specific group that you're trying to look at. That's one strategy. Another strategy that we've also found is having sort of a neutral third party come in, look at the data, and then present the results and say, like, okay, here's what this group is saying, and here's what here are some options that you could work with it. But really, trying to protect the anonymity has been a huge issue that I think many of us grapple with when we're trying to engage with equity in data.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Sort of leads us into a conversation about avoiding that data science powered bias, or avoiding bias in data science powered businesses. So, and I'll throw it back to you, to Vince, and and SOMTA as well. So we know, we were talking about how a model is only as good as its training. And I'd love for you also to kind of explain, when we say training, I think some people sort of have an understanding of what that means. It's not sort of, going in and sitting, I sort of picture this like this model actually going to training camp or something like that. But how can we be better about building those models that avoid bias? So how can we sort of train? Because like you said before, it's all human powered. So how are we training those models to be unbiased? And what responsibility do we each have to question data models and data collection? I'm gonna, later on, we'll talk a little bit about sort of what any individual who's listening to this today or in the future can kind of take as a role to ask some of those questions. It can sometimes be a difficult conversation to manage up or laterally to have those difficult conversations. But first off, sort of what responsibility do we each have to ask those questions about our data models and data collection? So Vince, why don't you get us started with that, and then we'll get SOMTA's input on that as well.
Sure. I mean, I think we all have a responsibility to question our data, right? Like, I think similarly to how we vet news sources in 2020, how we vet citations, we need to be tracing back the methods to see if there are biases or not. Well, let me rephrase that, to see not if there are biases, but as Lindsay mentioned, what those biases are, right? And I think one of the ways that we can get better at building models that avoid bias is Nicholas's organization, right? We need to make sure that our data teams that are building the models, the people building the algorithms, the people interpreting the algorithms, the people analyzing the algorithms, acting on those algorithms are representative of our communities, right? I think, again, in sort of advocacy terms, we hear a lot the phrase, nothing about us without us. And I think truly that applies to data as well. You need someone who understands the communities that we're looking at, and they need to be actually looking at the data and the models, building models, not just being the people whose data are being collected. So I think exactly what Nicholas's organization is doing, and organizations like that, getting more underrepresented communities into the STEAM fields is paramount.
Since you mentioned Nicholas, before going over to SOMTA, I would love to hear, Nicholas, do you actually build this into your curriculum in any way, shape, or form? I mean, I think you may kind of start with early STEM education or even STEAM education, but once you're getting into a little more advanced work, is this something you talk about with your instructors, with the mentors that you have, or anyone else who's kind of participating in your program?
Sure. Yes and no. Talking about data from this standpoint might be a little high level for our kids right now, but just kind of piggybacking on what Vince was saying earlier, there's going to be bias. And I think one of the easiest ways to really eliminate that bias is to go and talk to the population that you're actually surveying and hoping to collect information about. For example, if we have some kids at school A and then school B, then school A kids are failing at their typing courses. School B kids, they're doing great. Everyone's thriving. Now, you can take those numbers and say, okay, these percentages, they're doing this well. Now, the data can fail because that failure can come from multiple different places. Let's say that school doesn't have computers. Let's say that school is in an under-resourced neighborhood. Let's say this school is full of kids that maybe don't have hands. There's just so many different possibilities to why data can actually fail. Now, as far as do we teach our kids about data bias at this level? Not quite. It's a lot more things that are a lot more elementary, like, hey, how many water droplets can this penny hold, and stuff like that. Of course, simplifying it, but
sure, you have to start with the foundation, start with the basics. Absolutely.
You have to start with the foundation. We have to teach our kids basic mathematics before we teach them how to interpret data.
Incidentally, how many drops of water can a penny hold?
It's been a while since I've done that experiment.
Okay. I think that one is actually on your website, and I've never done it, so I don't have any plans this weekend, so I'll give it a shot. I'll report back to the group.
Yeah, let us know. I don't get to get to the classroom as much as I used to these days. So
the website, and I commend you for this. I didn't actually take a look, I would say, before 7 months ago, but I think that what I understand is a lot of those experiments and things like that for children who are maybe not in the full-time program or want to continue their learning independently. There are a set of kind of data science, STEM related exercises on the website that can be done from home for anyone. So learning those foundations, and that's been really cool to see. So I am tempted to do some of them myself. So jumping, I actually want to jump forward from what we were just talking about over to Samta. In addressing the importance of data bias with clients, students, or the public. I mean, everyone on this panel has someone that they are, I don't want to say beholden to, but someone that they work for, right? And almost everyone works for someone or works at least with someone. So those can sometimes be difficult conversations, and they can be especially difficult conversations, I think, for people working in the data science space, the technology space. Things are a little bit more specialized and not really very well understood, and almost sort of feared by people who don't understand it. So I'd love to talk about how you can convey that and sort of translate. One of what I referred to myself when I was working with LA County, I referred to myself as the chief technology translator. I was in a communication role, but it was sort of a joke that there is such a lack of understanding and kind of common language. So what's something that you do when you work with clients to kind of convey that common language and that understanding of this value of data?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rebecca, because I describe my job as a data storyteller, and then I feel like, yeah, that's like kind of easy. But now that you ask me that question, it makes me think, right? Because there are a lot of instances where when you are in a niche area, right? Like when you're a data scientist or you're a data engineer or you're a data visualization expert, and we all tend to do this, right? I tend to do it, right? Being an analytics practitioner, like we tend to talk our language, right? We tend to use our acronyms. We tend to, throw things out there that we assume that people would understand, right? And I have learned it over years is that sometimes it's really, really good to decode, right? And just talk like you're talking to your 4-year-old, right? And help people understand the value that they can get from this data, but in their language and at where they're starting from, their level of maturity. And I think that has helped me over the years in working with our clients, right? There have been instances, right, where the client is expecting a certain answer from the data. And it's really, really hard to kind of explain to them why the data is telling a different story, right? Though that is the first place why we got hired is to let data tell the story, right? It's still not a very easy conversation, but I think the key to this is meet your clients where they're at, or meet people, whoever is your stakeholder, where they're at, explain it to them in their language, understand their business challenges very well, right? Sometimes they are trying to solve a question, but there are different things that they need to think about while solving for that. So I think just laying it out is something that has helped me personally, and I think would be helpful for people just getting in this field. And Nicholas, honestly, I do have to get on your website because I feel like I have lost track of what I did in my STEM days to go on and take that quiz. So that's been on my mind, even while I was saying this question.
You'll have a whole weekend full of STEM experiments ready for you. Yeah,
please check us out.
Sometimes I love what you're saying, though. It's I think very often people, and Vince and Lindsay, I'd love to hear from you both on this, because you've both worked with public sector as well, and with some kind of challenging and sensitive data. But oftentimes people are wanting, without a true understanding of what data is or what it can actually lead you to know, and what it can reveal, they're oftentimes looking for you to prove what they want to show. And that's very rarely ends up being the case, right? So take our data and tell the story that we are hoping to in a PR kind of fashion. So Lindsay, you shared some of the work that you had done, which certainly led to transformations and proving that the data was not where you wanted to have it be leading. But if you could share a little bit more about that work.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, what makes good data is well-documented data, right? Like really well-documented data. And that's not just like a data dictionary, but actually like includes the information that the data producers, the assumptions that they brought to their work, and some of the biases that they know exist in the data just based on their own examination. So as an example of that, when I worked in New York City, I remember being at a conference and somebody that worked at the Department of Health and Human Hygiene was responding to a question and a prompt for city agencies to open their data. And he raised his hand expressing concern about opening his data sets, and specifically data sets about the number of mental health discharges in particular communities across New York City, both within mental health facilities, but also in drug rehabilitation facilities and drug clinics, right? And he was like, if people are going to look at this data, they're going to assume that all of our drug problems, alcohol problems are situated right within minority communities. And he's like, as an expert in this area, I know that that's not why the data is going to show mental health discharges in those communities. I know it's because that's where mental health facilities are in New York City, right? And the reason that they're there is because more privileged, wealthier communities have been able to lobby to get those facilities out of their backyards, right? And if that's not documented in the data, then people are not going to be able to make that assumption when they're first downloading it. And this is both important for communities that might be accessing this open government data, but also data sets like this are oftentimes the basis for different companies, organizations, data science research, right? So it's so critical that a lot of those biases and assumptions are outlined ahead of time before people go and make use of them.
Yeah, Vince, what's been your experience in working with in and with government in your role?
Sure. Well, first I got to say, like, the idea of data documentation is like, oh, like music to my ears. And again, not just like a data dictionary. So +1 to that.
And what about data sharing too?
Oh
that
my gosh. I think, you know, I will say that it is rare that working with public agencies, I get someone saying, you know, directly, like, we need to prove something. We need to, like, we have an answer. We need to back it up. But when I do get an inkling of that, whether that's working within government or with government, to me, it always comes back to like, okay, wait, we got to pause. What is your objective here? And really having a frank discussion with that decision maker, right? Like, I think a lot of folks have this idea that they can hide behind the data and they don't have to really explain themselves. And I've had to have a couple of frank conversations with some data leaders, some IT leaders about, tell me why you have a preconceived notion of what the data should say, or tell me why you think that way. And it's hard because I try to approach it from a kind of curiosity standpoint. I try to be, you know, really understand their perspective. I don't try to attack them and shut them down, but I really need to understand why they're moving me that direction. And I find that when I do that, and again, immense courage, immense pressure, I find that by then we can sort of veer off from that path, right? Like, it's a very difficult concept, and there's also all sorts of political elements and interpersonal elements at play, but really kind of sitting down with curiosity, genuine curiosity, no blaming, and trying to understand why they're wanting to kind of influence the data in a certain way has been super helpful.
And it adds that context to why they're asking those questions, giving you the full story of what's led them to make the decision to do things with data, and perhaps to bring data scientists onto their team or to contract out work to them. Either way, to be digging deeper is generally, we hope, a good thing. So at least it's adding more context to just keep having those conversations. And I think that question is important because you know, as people are moving up and around in their careers, to have a sense of working with different individuals at different levels with different understandings, I guess that sort of helps. It actually is sort of a building of a diverse team, right? Your diverse team may include people who do not understand even what data actually is. So it's part of that kind of foundational building elements. So one thing I think is important to talk about, we've all seen some examples, some sort of high profile misuse of data, maybe different models that have been built that clearly have bias built into them. So, I think weighing that cost of action versus inaction with data is always going to be a factor in addressing any organizational change. So right now, especially, organizations are facing challenges with funding and potential difficulties with understanding how to offer training or work collaboratively as a newly distributed workforce. These are just some sort of practical challenges that organizations are facing. And so I'd love to hear any input on truly how organizations can address that, or individuals can address that within their own training. Certainly conferences and free training and education are one resource, but how do you balance that cost of acting versus inaction? And I'll start with Samta on that one. And
Sure. So I'll take Rebecca to the point that you were making, right? I think the cost of inaction versus the cost of action for organizations per se is really, really big, right? We have, thankfully, with everything that we have seen and the way data is exploding, there are regulatory requirements that companies now have that they have to cater to, right? So the cost of inaction in this case is that you will be slapped with big fines, and there's a lot of reputational risk associated with that, right? I think taking a different view on the cost of inaction to be responsible when you're using AI is a big reputational risk, right? And I think that responsibility in AI does not only come from just having the right data, but it comes through the phase from design to deploying your data, to training your models, to making sure that the insights that are coming out of those models are accurate, right? I wish we had like numbers that could quantify the cost of inaction. I don't have those numbers, but I can definitely point out to say that it is huge. So now is the time to take an action to make sure that anything that we are doing that touches data is going through not only a quantitative assessment, but a qualitative assessment as well, right? The data sets are looked at, the models that are built, the training data sets are looked at, the deployment is looked at, and everything through and through till the insights is taken care of. But I definitely feel the time is now.
So Lindsay, you're in education, and Nicholas, you're in sort of education nonprofit, working closely with education and educational institutions. What do you recommend to the folks the students that you both work with to sort of carry on their education, some resources that they can look to continue to educate themselves in this space, and ways that they can take that on themselves? I'll start with Lindsay.
Sure. So the first thing that I tell students is that anytime they see a number reported anywhere, the very first thing that they should ask themselves is according to what definition, right? And so just kind of building in these tools of critical reflection as it comes to data, for me, is the very first step of kind of addressing these problems, right? Of not taking numbers for granted and understanding that there's always going to be categorical judgments that underlie any sort of values that we produce, right? Though in addition to that, there's a number of really great organizations that have propped up in the past few years that have really been calling attention to some of these algorithmic injustices. There's the Algorithmic Injustice League, there's Data for Black Lives, there's a lot of abolitionist organizations that are advocating for more data around policing and whatnot. And so I've encouraged students to really follow along with these organizations and stay up to date with what kinds of outputs they're producing, because a lot of times they're really oriented towards improving data science and ensuring that there's more equity in who experiences both the harms and the benefits of data representation.
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
have to piggy. I'm sorry?
No, I was just going to see about your input on that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would have to piggyback on what Lindsay just said. It's all about the definitions of how we're defining the data. What are we actually collecting? If we jump back to the water droplet example, if one kid has a dropper that is distributing a very small amount, and then another kid has a dropper that is distributing a much larger amount of water, it's still a drop, without us putting a definition or context by it, which makes us produce very bad data if we actually look at it from that standpoint. So we want to make sure that the definitions are clear, and then also make sure that transparency is there so everyone knows, not just this microcosm has an understanding of what this data means, but it's something that is being able to be understood by a much larger populace.
Vince, within that conversation, what working with the different organizations and specifically public sector organizations, what are some ways that you suggest to organizations to take action that can, they're doing something to act, and so avoiding that cost of inaction, we hope. But what sort of a first step you recommend to organizations to start asking questions about data?
Yeah, well, I think I want to lay the foundation that, around the conversation about risk or cost of not acting, I think one of the things that we all need to acknowledge as people that work in and around data is that the risks of not acting is shouldered disproportionately based on your level of privilege, right? So for organizations like ours, like if we don't act, okay, we might lose some revenue or we might lose some political will, but the people who the data are supposed to support, they lose a lot more. They lose lives,
and then
they lose
in public
resources.
sector, we tend to say we're the stewards of data, education as well, right? Rather than it being your own data, it's not actually yours. It's the individuals, the citizens that you represent. So
the governmental agency may just be like, oh, well, I guess we're not going to do that, and it's going to affect some of our metrics. But for the people that the programs are for, there's a huge impact there. And so, the first step I always like to say is, and I don't know how much people like this, but you need to educate yourself. You need to educate yourself if you're a person in a role that's collecting data. One of the easiest and most low cost ways I feel is to just educate yourself on the history of I think a pretty short history of equity in data. Educate yourself on how institutionalized racism and discrimination can really pervade a lot of our systems we think are objective. I think that is a great, low cost, very easy way to start making better, more equitable data decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, because as we're talking about being the stewards of data, I think people really in most organizations, most industries, take that responsibility to heart. They do feel like they want to do right by people. It's just a lack of, generally, a lack of knowing where to start, knowing how to sort of join those conversations, be part of that. And they may not even feel like it's sort of necessarily their responsibility, but usually it's out of a lack of sort of understanding. So I think education is certainly the key to that, and understanding what the implications are of the work that they do. So that's a really great point. And in speaking of that, since we are all from different sort of types of industries or serve different industries, I'd like to hear what value we gain from seeing how similar or dissimilar organizations address diversity in data. So what data can be used to measure the success of those strategies? How if someone already has a program in place, how do they know that they're doing well with that? How do they kind of constantly reevaluate to put themselves in a place where they are evolving these decisions? So I'll start with Lindsay on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with just ascertaining on what kinds of harms are being produced from the particular data processes that are being propagated, but also just like really critical assessments of how communities are responding to the different data processes that are being carried out within these organizations. For me, it's so critical that as we've been talking about, this kind of piece of inclusivity involves more than just bringing people to the table, but it also involves creating the support structures where people feel as though it's a safe space for them to be communicating what their insights are and what their perspectives are in relation to different data science problems. And also that data science problems are structured in a way where they're advocating for things that people care about and things that they care about in regards to their own lives and their own communities, et cetera, right? And so kind of some of these metrics for success might involve, figuring out not just like how many people do we have at the table and contributing to data science and contributing to data science problem setting and analysis, but also what kind of support structures are we providing that enable people to stay in the community and enabling them to want to stay in the community, and how can we measure, just beyond like how many of each type of face we have at the table.
Absolutely. So sometime, without naming the names of any clients, what are some ways that you've worked with people and to set up those measures of success, and what have they looked like in different organizations you've worked with?
Yeah, so I actually want to underline something very important that Lindsay kind of brought up, and we haven't really spoken about a lot, is the culture as well, right? We talk about representative workforce, we talk about success, but I think the key part is whether you have a representative workforce when you're measuring success, or whether you truly have a culture of doing it, right? Like on paper, I can have a stellar workforce with like 20% diversity, like 20% people from this race, but if the data scientists on the table or the people who are making decisions don't feel empowered to even talk about what they think is not success, right? It's just not useful, right? So there's like a big component, and Lindsay, thank you for bringing this up, because like to me, I think that's like very, very, very important when you're measuring success. It's not about what you're doing with your data, how you're doing it with your data. It's about what is the end goal and how are you accomplishing it? Are you truly able to accomplish it because you've built a culture around your workforce to accomplish success? Or are you just on paper saying that you have all these people represented, you think your data is the best because you have all this representation, but at the end of the day, in spite of seeing that the model's not performing the way it should, no one speaks up, right? So I think like to me, success is a multifaceted, and like it has many metrics, but it just depends on how you decide to measure it. And there are different levers that one needs to have to make sure that you're successful.
One kind of final question I have, and then I do have some questions that I'd like to talk about resources and some rapid fire questions for each of our panelists. But what have each of you seen or done when it's known that, again, no bad data, but if you see a model that's been built that's producing sort of bad outcomes? Lindsay, you had some experience like this in New York, and you were able to actually sort of extract useful information still out of this bad data. How have you worked with people to do that? Is it sometimes, or have you ever made the decision to sort of kill a model and to say it's time to move on and restart or reframe our data collection? So Lindsay, one example that you shared with us where you did that. Have you seen other examples where you've kind of had to make the decision to move on or to kind of repurpose? I think repurposing it can be a real uphill battle, but certainly there's reasons to do it.
Yeah, for sure. So in my own research, I studied in one of the research projects that I'm examining right now, I study the way that environmental injustices and mass incarceration have kind of buttressed each other in collaboration with some colleagues at UCLA. And all the environmental data that we have about prisons themselves is really quite messy and flawed data. There's a lot of missing information. We know that a lot of that data has been reported by the same organizations they're meant to hold accountable. And so there is these kinds of issues that are underlying all of these data sets that we're using to aggregate and try and repurpose towards addressing issues of environmental injustice and other forms of social injustice, right? And for us, we know the data is flawed. We go through and we document every single time that we find issues of missing data, issues where certain ways of categorizing the data categorically excluded some people from being represented in the data. We try and document things that we notice about if there's within the data set itself, if there are certain ways that we can computationally show inconsistencies in the data and figure out some of the politics that might lead to those things. But for the most part, it's really about documenting those particular components and then figuring out how can we work with flawed data, right? How can we work with fractured and flawed data? Because there's not going to be a perfect data set. And while we are going to advocate and we're going to push for these government agencies to do better data production, and we're going to put that research out in the world, at the same time, we also recognize that there's really important ways that people need to learn to work with that data and to not cover up the inconsistencies or the biases, but to draw them out and have them really quite available. And I think we're really seeing this right now with all the data we have about COVID-19. It is incredibly flawed data. It is incredibly non-representative of what's actually going on in the world. And we absolutely need it for good policy making. And so I'm hoping that we can train the next generation of data scientists to really think critically about how they can leverage data that has some of these issues in them, draw those issues and uncertainties to the surface and document them, and also learn how to advocate for better data collection.
So Vince, what's your take on that, having worked with organizations and been part of organizations where you were taking on data collection?
Yeah, absolutely. I think plus one again to everything Lindsay had said. One of the things I like to see is like if we have a flawed data project or we're gathering something that isn't representative or is shocking to the communities that it's supposed to represent, that's a really great opportunity to not ditch it, but to augment it and to say, okay, you know what, this survey was flawed. We've asked something completely incorrectly. Let's do some focus groups around this. Let's add some qualitative data aspects to this quantitative project we might have had, right? Like I think often for a lot of organizations that I serve and partner with, they're really interested in all sorts of surveys and thinking that surveys can kind of provide all the information you could ever need. Surveys can also be very easily flawed. And so in that case, like rather than maybe discard the data, I found very effective to, say, okay, this survey actually had some pretty big concerns with it. Let's bolt on a couple of focus groups or a couple of listening sessions to really think about, we want to probe deeper into some of these questions, and also acknowledging to the communities when you meet with them in those settings, we messed up. We didn't have the right questions, or we didn't ask this in a culturally appropriate way. And so I think kind of anything to foster more connection when there is a flawed project, I've seen be very successful in not only just turning that project around, but really making it a much better project than it could have been originally.
Yeah, leading back to the transparency. Right? The transparency does help to build trust. So trust in communities and organizations. So very important. So I'll lead into a couple of rapid fire questions I have. So I'll start, and these are going to apply to each one of our panelists. So we'll start with Nicholas. What single technology solution or process initiative are you most excited about that could offer hope in addressing representative data?
That's a good one. A piece of technology that could equate to more representative data. I honestly feel as this isn't really a tech question. It has roots in which we're going to be leveraging tech, but just as we, so many people have been saying on this call here, it's the human element. There needs to be a human change, a different shift in consciousness to really understand what it is that we're doing here. Because we can go and say, hey, we collected this number and this number and this number, but oftentimes, and this is speaking, not knocking any of my STEM people, we're smart bunch, but sometimes we're not always the most socially adept. So we also need to make sure that as we're collecting this data, we're making sure to not forget the human element of things. I know this was supposed to be rapid fire, so I'll be brief and succinct in my answer there.
No, that's great. And I think you're leading into probably what this question will probably lead us all to. Sometime I had a conversation about this just earlier today, and she said something very similar. She was really struggling, like there's no technology that sort of answers any of these things, or any technology could be as good as the next to address some of these things and do data visualization, but it's a people thing. So yeah, no, I think you're right on track with that.
No, absolutely, Rebecca. And yeah, I know our conversation was what was going through my mind as Nicholas was speaking as well. But yeah, I agree with you, Nicholas. I think it's also like the unconscious bias, right? I think that is a big element to take into consideration as well, is that sometimes we don't know. We just don't know, right? But we are being, we have these biases within us that we really need to be very, very aware of. So I think that's a big part of, how I would look at the process.
So let's set that question aside. I think we're agreeing that it's a people transformation. So what's one transformation to address diversity in data or data organizations that you would implement to your practice or organization, or suggest to others if they needed sort of a starting point? If budget and resources were not a constraint, or you're welcome to apply whatever budgets and resources constraint as you like to this question. So when we will address this one to everyone because it is the people related question. I think we all agree that it's driven by the human input. So we'll start with Vince on that.
Sure. I think one thing that I would like implemented if budget and resources were not a concern is that every data project should have a very extensive equity impact review, right? I think we need to look at every research project that we're doing, whether it's collecting very simple, easy surveys to kind of broad longitudinal data collection programs, or we're trying to build prediction algorithms or whatever. I think any data program should have a very extensive equity review. And what that should do is, what is the impact on marginalized communities? How are we engaging marginalized communities in this work? And what are the substantive positive outcomes for marginalized communities that justify doing this work in the first place, right? Like, I think we need to center the populations that we're serving in our research projects, remind ourselves why we're doing these things to begin with, and really kind of suss out what's the likely impact here and how can we mitigate that.
Great. Lindsay, what about you? Budget resource constraint, what would you have people take on?
I would love to see every organization that's doing any form of data analysis, data production, to have like a social equity committee that is responsible for not only figuring out how it is that their particular data sets that they're producing are going to be adhering to social equity, et cetera, but also that are figuring out what are the value frameworks according to the organization that they're operating, and how it is that the organization that's working with those data sets is actually meeting those particular value frameworks, right? Figuring out this, it might involve figuring out what kind of cultures we want to build within these communities, right? So what kinds of structures are going to actually support diversity amongst organizations that are doing these kinds of data analyses, and also trying to figure out like how is it that we are going to embed those values into our data practice on a daily, not on an overall sense, but on a day-to-day, like decision by decision sense. Yeah.
Nicholas,
Hi,
now we're talking about people.
Sorry.
So
I just want to interrupt. There's you have about 10 minutes for this meeting.
yes, yep. I'm keeping an eye on the time. So Nicholas, what is one people-related transformation that you would address or recommend to others to address within their organizations if budget and resources were not a constraint?
Well, I think we have to have an understanding of the population that we're actually serving. Having an understanding of the population that we're serving, and if we do not know that population, go actively seek out someone that actually does know that population. If we're speaking in terms of people, it's the overall strategy. It's not just the numbers. It's so much more than just the numbers that are collected, but what do the numbers mean? How did we actually come to set numbers? So let's say that I'm trying to figure out, all right, I want to know the number of 3-spotted giraffes in the desert. How many 3-spotted giraffes are in the desert? Well, your question is wrong in the first place because giraffes don't live in the desert. So you want to go to the place where you can actually reach the population that you're actually hoping to learn more about. So let's see, being intentional about your marketing, your outreach, and also being firm in what question are you actually trying to answer, because that question is going to drive everything else that you do from there. So just thinking a little bit deeper there.
Yeah. And Samta, what do you? What is your?
Oh, my fellow panelists just blew my mind. So now I have points to add. But truly, +1 to everything they said. And I think if I had unlimited resources, or if the clients I worked for had unlimited budget and resources, I would make sure that all of the data scientists that are working on projects related to any industry, anything that they're working on, are trained extremely well on responsible AI. Like, everyone understands what it is and the impacts of not knowing what they're building and how that could affect the larger community. So that's what I would definitely focus on.
All right, and as our final question, what's one resource each of you would suggest, a resource that we know to exist? So this actually truly has no budget or resource constraints to it, that you would suggest, whether it's a training, an organization, a website, podcast, anything, to stay informed about this subject, that you can suggest to our listeners. And I'll put a plug in for Women in Data, which is an organization founded out of Sacramento, but it's actually an international organization now with many different chapters. And it was how I came to know about Lindsay's work, actually. So I'll put a plug in for that one, which has been useful for me in kind of educating myself about this subject and other kind of data adjacent topics. So Vince, what's a resource that you would recommend to folks?
Okay, I got two, and these aren't specific to data, but I think they're very relevant, and actually relevant to kind of everything, kind of broader than data. Two books. I referenced one of them, one by Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think required reading. And the second required reading is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I think those two books in combination not only can help you and your organizations become better data-driven organizations, but also lead the way in doing equity work overall.
What about Samta?
Yeah, I had a plugin for a book as well, but it's mainly Humans plus Machine. It's by Paul Doherty. Look that up. I really like that book because it talks about, like, how do humans and machines truly come together, and how humans still have the ability to make the decisions, and how you utilize everything to make sure that you're doing the right things along the way.
And I know Lindsay has a whole book list that I've seen, so I'll add those ones to the list, and we'll see if we can share that out to folks after, as the video list goes out. But Lindsay, why don't you share? I know you're familiar with a number of organizations and books as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that book list. And my dog just got back from her walk, so
there you go. And it's enthusiastic participant.
She was gone for a walk for an hour and a half, and she wants to play. Actually, do you mind circling back around?
Sure. So we'll go over to Nicholas, and we will give a plug to your organization. You don't have to use your plug for that, because we do think that the Square Root Academy is an excellent resource. But what's one additional resource? We're all going there for our STEM education and experiments very shortly. What's another one that you would recommend?
Okay, I was trying, because I seen you all recommended such insightful books. It wasn't a book. I wasn't going to plug Square Root Academy, but another organization that I founded. So Scholars Playground. So Scholars Playground is the 21st century online learning platform for scholars during this period and even beyond. So on the platform, it has free classes on yoga, meditation, creative writing, spoken word, of course, coding, really to make sure for the parents that are at home kind of struggling with this whole distance learning thing, we want to make sure that the kids are able to stay connected to extracurricular activities beyond traditional academia. So it's completely free. Sign up. It has classes for ages K through 12. Also, our university partners on there offer free tutoring to youth. So to help out those parents out there and people that just really want to take care of the youth.
Love it. And Lindsay, do you still have your dog joining you?
I'm good now.
We welcome all pets, all children.
I appreciate that. She likes to make her presence in a room known. So there's this great resource by the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy organization, and it's called A Toolkit for Centering Racial Equity Within Data Integration. And what I really like about this particular toolkit is that oftentimes a lot of the reading, the book list that I would share have a lot of ways that data has gone wrong, right? And what's really nice about this particular toolkit is that it actually gives some actionable steps that you can take at every single stage of the data analysis process. So from collection all the way through visualization and publication to really think about how you can center racial equity within your work. So I'm happy to share that resource. In the book.
That's excellent. I think very spot on to what we're trying to convey with our audience today and anyone who will be watching in the future is this isn't just sort of what's gone wrong, what all the sort of bad examples that we've seen, but it's how to do things right and how to apply these things to data. As in some case, we're all the stewards of data. So I think that's excellent. So we'll wrap it up from here. Thank you to Nicholas, Samta, Lindsay, and Vince for being with us today and having this conversation. Thank you to the attendees for joining our session. Our goal was for folks to leave this session with an understanding of the importance of diversity in data and data organizations, and also have some ideas and resources on how to take action in their own organization. So I hope we've met that goal today. Thank you again to DataCon LA and the event sponsors. And we'll just close it out by saying, be well, be safe, wear a mask, and vote. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Samta. Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you, Vince.
Great. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Evening. Yes. Have a good weekend, everybody. Goodbye.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.